In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. Welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards, and joining me today is Denielle Sachs, the Global Head of APCO Impact. Denielle, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell our audience, bring us in, what is APCO Impact and how do you define impact?
How do I define impact? Well, APCO Impact is the sustainability and impact group within APCO Worldwide. So we sit within a large global public affairs agency. We're a boutique that does management consulting for the social sector. So we work a lot with companies on their ESG strategies, helping them set really bold climate agendas. We work on DEI and equity and justice strategies. We work with tons of foundations and philanthropies, nonprofits, you name it, across a range of social sector issues. How I define impact, it is, it looks really different in different places, but in the shortest sense of the word, it's progressive action that leads to actual tangible outcomes for communities, people, planet.
Love it. Now, how long have you been at APCO per se?
So I actually started my own company back in 2015 called the Tembo Group. It was a boutique consultancy that focuses on all these same issues. We were acquired in January 2020 by APCO.
Yes.
It was obviously a very different world in January 2020, so we've seen obviously these issues explode into popular consciousness with COVID and everything that happened around racial equity last year, so it's been quite the journey.
Well, the reason I asked Denielle is, how has the conversation changed when you approach business owners about setting these big impact goals from when you started to where you are now?
It's changed in every way. I would say first and foremost, we're finding it's easier. There's a lot more companies coming to us rather than us having to go to them. There's a lot more companies, I would say, motivated in large part by investment community starting to care about these issues. So we're getting a lot of the folks that have not been in the ESG game, have not really been in the impact game for a long time or ever, who are coming and trying to figure out what does it mean to actually report on ESG, to actually have strategy that is tied to corporate strategy on ESG. So it's changed because companies are proactively trying to figure this out. And it's not really a dirty, even the term philanthropy is not, I call it a dirty word in philanthropy for a long time. Now companies are actually, what is the best and highest use of corporate philanthropic dollars? There's a way to use that strategically in the larger picture of ESG work.
If I'm a large private label company or consumer and packaging, why would I care about ESG? What's the business case for measuring your environmental, social, and governance impact?
One, you don't have a choice anymore.
I don't have a choice.
Nobody has a choice anymore. This is, one, you're either going to get regulated into this. So when you look at issues like environmental issues or climate issues, companies are not going to have a choice anymore.
Really?
That's first. Secondly, you don't have a choice because your stakeholders are demanding different levels of action and accountability. So I think we're seeing a whole movement around accountability with companies that are making commitments and not following through on those. So we've seen the whole sort of lifespan of commitments that were made in the wake of George Floyd's murder last year, and now companies that have not actually made good on their promises starting to be held to account in the public domain. And so a lot more companies are going to just face backlash from the public, from their workforce, and from consumers. So it is not a choice anymore. It is critical to survival.
That's really good to know. And it's interesting to think about that. I guess I could see why a lot of people are coming to you now versus you going out to them. They need to make this change. Let's talk about the S. A lot of people refer to it as the messy middle. How do you define social changes and how do you measure something like that?
The messy middle. So I haven't heard that one. The S is interesting. We've done a lot of work to look at what is the S. And I don't call it the messy middle, but I call it the sort of softer, it's a much more complex set of issues, which really are focused on workforce, community, equity, justice, a ton of issues that are interconnected, but on their own are incredibly complex. Historically, the S has been a resting spot for philanthropic programs for a lot of companies. So I would say before COVID, there was very little attention paid to the S in any systematic or comprehensive way. What we saw as workforce issues took center stage in COVID, right? What are you doing for your workers in the middle of COVID? Are you providing them with, stipends or a job? Are you keeping them there? What are the actual things that you're doing for your workforce? And we saw a lot of that happening. The S took center stage, particularly for investors. So there is a microscope that's been put on it. And so we're seeing a real emphasis on companies and how they're treating their workers, and workers are starting to really hold companies accountable by walking out and not staying in those companies. So you're seeing real churn at companies that don't have really solid workforce policies.
Do you believe that the ESG score, if you will, or the ESG measurement tool can also increase productivity within your own organization if your leadership has a focus on ESG? Do you see any correlation?
On productivity and ESG scoring, so if we just separate out what ESG scores are, I would say on that front, reporting and ESG scores have started to become too much of an obsession for companies. So a lot of companies, because they're seeing pressure from investors, are starting to overemphasize and overfocus on scores. Mm-hmm. There's really only so much you can do to influence scores, especially in the near term. What we like to say is good business decisions lead to good outcomes and good ESG scores. So the real need is to focus on good ESG policies and practices. And yes, good ESG policies and practices, like in the case of belonging, inclusion practices and policies. We've done a lot of work around mom policy, like good mom policies. All of that leads to better productivity.
Mm. How does an ESG score help a company like, a big oil company that's here at the conference or somewhere else? Like, how does an ESG score help an organization like that become more focused on ESG, I guess?
Again, scoring scoring comes out of the investment community, right? ESG is really technically just a reporting framework. So it's a rubric that has a lot of different frameworks and different types of like taxonomies that you can use to measure your impact across a lot of different dimensions. All of that is being driven by the investment community because they need scores to essentially make sure, like financial reporting, you're meeting your basic obligations. So scoring itself isn't necessarily going to lead to good ESG policy or good ESG outcomes. You have to sort of start from what is the environmental impact of a company? What is the societal impact of this company? Do we have good governance? And then figure out what the most material issues are, where you need to focus first, where your biggest vulnerabilities and risks are, and where your biggest opportunities are for impact. And then devise a strategy that will allow a company to maximize its impact, be, at some level of peace, if you will, with society, that then will allow them to have a positive footprint, which in turn hopefully leads to real value drivers in the business and in society.
I've also heard that ESG, it really, from the investor side, helps people look at these companies with like a risk lens on, because it's about managing risk for these investments. How have you seen in the investing community step up over these past 10 years? Are they asking more for these reports these scores? Are they asking more for organizations like yours to go in and help them with their being a good business? What have you seen from the investing side that can influence business?
I mean, like I said at the very beginning, I think the investment community is single-handedly driving a massive shift in corporate behavior right now. So the excuse before, if I may, March 2020 was investors are not asking for this. Once investors stop focusing on short-term dollars and figures, then we can start to make long-term decisions. That was what we heard over and over from companies that were in this catch-22, where even if they felt like they could make or wanted to make long-term decisions, they were being held. They were being held to a different standard by investors. What we've seen in the midst of COVID and all of the activity of the last 18 months is investors have really turned a corner and focused. They've focused and doubled down on ESG. And because a global pandemic created this massive risk for the global economic system, investors have had to figure out really quickly, how do we make sure that the companies in our portfolios are actually not at great risk and are not exacerbating the risk to our global economies?
Interesting.
So it's not the other way around. It's literally the investment community moving all these companies to start to take real action on ESG.
Have these organizations that are like fundamentally environmental or focused on environmental risks, or I guess improvements, social improvements and governance improvements, have you seen these organizations perform better in a year like 2020, 2021?
There's tons of research out there that shows the companies who were where this was already really core to their business have performed better because they were more resilient in the face of supply chain challenges. They were more resilient in the face of scrutiny that was coming in from the investment community and other stakeholders. Companies with good workforce policies were way ahead of the game. So yes, for sure.
It's good to hear it. It's inspiring, to see that the business community step up, and from 10 years ago to where we are now, businesses coming to you guys asking, hey, how can we do better? How can we improve? It's very inspiring to hear. Now, what leadership do we need to drive this change in your sector?
We need bold leadership to drive this. I think I always start when we're pulled in to do work, particularly with companies that are just beginning their ESG journey. Our first order of business is to figure out what that company's North Star is. What level of ambition do you have? Why are you actually doing this work? Is it on a spectrum of risk mitigation to opportunity and value creation? Like, where do you fall on that spectrum? And coalescing and really figuring out, like, across the leaders of that company where they fall on that spectrum allows you to set a ambition that is commensurate with what that company is ready to do. So you'll see a lot of companies that come in and there's like half of the C-suite and management are interested in doing it for, real opportunity creation, while the other half are like down on the other end and it's just about risk. So you're going to have to, unless you have like a single CEO who's ready to like really champion this, you're going to end up somewhere in the middle in terms of your level of ambition. And I don't think that's enough, frankly. Like, I think we need more of those CEOs, like the Paul Pullmans, who, very famously stood up and said, we're not going to do quarterly reporting anymore because it's just holding us hostage to short-term thinking that does not allow us to create long-term value for this company. And so he made some really difficult decisions that have been lauded time and time again, and it's a business that has shown incredible value, to your question before, from making those difficult decisions, but the right decisions. So yeah, it's bold leadership that's willing to do the thing that is not the most popular, but is future focused and recognizes that these are the right things to do, and doing the right thing is ultimately going to create value for that company.
Danielle, is that your definition of a real leader? Bold leadership?
Yes, Absolutely. It is part of, it is an essential part in today's day and age where the challenges in front of us are so huge, and the time that we have to address these huge challenges is very fast running out. And so we need the boldest of leaders to take us forward so that we're moving fast enough to keep up with the challenges and get ahead of them.
Lovely. Thank you so much for coming on the Real Leaders Podcast today, Denielle. For Denielle Sachs, I'm Kevin Howard, asking you to go out there, be bold, and always keep it real. Thanks, Denielle.
Thank you.